My name is Lana. The night I told my family I got a full scholarship, they laughed. My mother said she only got it because she's poor. I sat there, silent, burning with shame, disbelief, and something I hadn't felt in years, rage. That moment shattered the version of me they controlled. I didn't run. I walked away, finally choosing myself over their approval. I shared everything, what they said, how it broke me, and why I stopped staying quiet. Please listen to my story all the way through. Then tell me, did I do the right thing? Was I selfish for walking away, or was it the only way to breathe? I need your advice. It was a Thursday evening, the kind where the sky turns a dull gray long before the sun actually goes down. The grass had just been cut that morning, and the scent of it still clung to the breeze like something unfinished. There was a stickiness in the air that made everything feel slower, like even the wind was holding its breath. Inside, the kitchen was warm, a little too warm. The kind of heat that came from the oven being on too long, mixed with the scent of garlic and something slightly burnt. The table was already set when I came downstairs. Forks neatly aligned. Napkins folded with unnecessary precision. Mom's way of turning an ordinary dinner into some kind of stage play. Troy was already there, slouched in his chair, knees wide, scrolling under the table like always. Harold sat at the head of the table, halfway through a glass of sweet tea. He gave me a small nod when I walked in but didn't say anything. That was his thing, being present without ever really participating. And then there was Mom, sitting opposite me, her hair curled under just enough to make it seem effortless, makeup subtle but intact, like even in her own home, she had something to prove. Dinner was herbed chicken, mashed potatoes, and those green beans she always overcooked until they turned a kind of army green. It was familiar. Too familiar. I had the email saved on my phone. I'd read it in the bathroom before dinner 3 times, just to be sure it hadn't changed. Congratulations, Lana Merritt. You've been awarded the Kurtner Opportunity Scholarship to Reading Heights College. Full tuition. Room. Board. Books. Everything. I hadn't told anyone I applied. Not because I didn't want them to know, but because I already knew how they'd react. Still, part of me wanted to believe maybe this time would be different. So I told them. My voice came out softer than I meant it to, almost like I was apologizing for the news. I got the scholarship, I said, placing my fork down like that would make it more real. Troy didn't look up. What scholarship? He muttered, not bothering to swallow first. The Reading Heights one, I said. It's full tuition. Room and board too. There was a pause. A short breath of silence, like the room forgot itself for a second. Then Mom laughed. Not a joyful laugh. Not even a surprised one. It was sharp, like she was slicing through whatever I had just built in front of her. Oh, honey, she said, reaching for the butter. They must have felt real sorry for you. Troy snorted. So they're basically paying poor kids to show up now? No one said congratulations. No one asked what I wrote about. No one even looked at me long enough to register it. Harold stayed quiet, chewing slowly, eyes down, like he didn't want to get involved. Mom dabbed her mouth with a napkin and said, flatly, well, I guess that's nice. She only got it because she's poor. They always do that charity stuff in spring. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just stared at the condensation forming on my water glass, tracing one drop with my finger like it might give me something solid to hold on to. My ears burned. My chest felt like it was shrinking in on itself. I had spent days on that essay. Nights, actually, writing by the light of my phone, hiding under the covers because I didn't want to explain what I was doing. I had written about being invisible, about growing up in a house where being quiet wasn't a trait, it was a rule. I'd poured every part of myself into those paragraphs, and in less than 30 seconds, they had stripped it all down to pity. Later that night, I was brushing my teeth when Mom passed by the bathroom door. She paused, leaned in, and said, make sure you thank them properly. Wouldn't want them thinking you're ungrateful. Then she walked off like she'd reminded me to take the trash out. I stared into the mirror after she left, toothbrush still in hand, foam building in the corners of my mouth. I wasn't looking at my face. I was looking into my eyes, trying to figure out if I was the one who was wrong. Maybe I had imagined it meant something. Maybe I was just one of the lucky ones who checked the right box on the right form. But deep down, something in me shifted. It wasn't loud. It didn't roar. It cracked, just slightly, like old wood under pressure. For as long as I could remember, silence was my way of surviving. Don't argue. Don't cry. Don't expect too much. Be good. Be quiet. Keep the peace. But that night, silence didn't feel like protection. It felt like suffocation. And I knew, somewhere under the layers of disappointment and swallowed words, that this wasn't about pride. This was about the fact that maybe, just maybe, they never believed I could be more than what they already decided I was. The light in my room always felt softer after sunset. It wasn't anything special, just the way it came through the blinds, filtered and worn out, like daylight that had given up. That evening, it made the whole space feel quieter. Not peaceful, exactly. Just still. Like everything in the room was waiting for me to catch up. I sat cross-legged at my desk, the printed copy of my scholarship essay in front of me. The corners were frayed and bent from being shoved in and out of my backpack too many times. I hadn't looked at it since the night I hit submit. Even now, I hesitated before touching it, like it might bite if I wasn't careful. Back then, I almost didn't send it. I came so close to deleting the whole thing. Not because I didn't care. I cared too much. That was the problem. I wanted that scholarship more than I'd wanted anything in my life. But there was this voice in my head, low, familiar, and unshakable, that said they'd never see past the surface. That no matter how carefully I wrote, no matter how raw or honest I was, they'd just skim it, shrug, and toss it in a pile labeled, "Try again next year." But that voice wasn't really mine. It belonged to the kitchen table, to years of offhand comments and swallowed ambition. It sounded like Mom, like Troy, like the space between dinner and dishes where I used to practice being invisible. I opened the email again on my phone. I'd read it maybe 20 times already, but there was one sentence I kept coming back to. "We see promise in your voice." I didn't know who wrote it. Could have been a form letter. Could have been cut and pasted into 100 other emails. But still, I clung to it like a flotation device. Like if I held on tight enough, maybe it would pull me somewhere I actually belonged. Sometimes I whispered it to myself at night, just to hear how it sounded, just to believe for a second that it was real. But then the other voice came creeping back in. What if Mom was right? What if it wasn't talent they saw, but poverty? What if I was chosen not because of my words, but because I looked like someone they could rescue? What if all I was, what I'd always be, was a check mark in someone else's diversity box? I folded the paper and slid it back into my desk drawer like a secret. And then I just sat there. The silence used to be a kind of safety for me. It wrapped around me when the world was too loud. But lately, that silence had started to feel heavier. Like it was pressing down on me instead of holding me up. My phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't know.
Hey.
This is Jude. We met during the campus tour at Reading Heights. You probably don't remember me, but I remembered your voice in the seminar. You said something about stories being the safest way to tell the truth. That stuck. Congrats on the scholarship. You earned it. I just stared at the message for a long time. It's strange how a few lines from someone you barely know can feel more real than anything your own family's ever said. After a minute, I typed back, "Thanks. I didn't think anyone remembered that." His reply came right away. "Hard to forget someone who speaks with that much truth. You planning to move in early for orientation?" We messaged back and forth for a while. Nothing serious. Just easy. He told me the food was okay. The dorms smelled like popcorn and mildew, and the campus squirrels were oddly aggressive. Then I asked him how he got to Reading. He told me he got the same scholarship. A year before. His essay had been about growing up with a single mom who worked graveyard shifts at a diner. He used to wait for her on the curb with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. "I thought I got in because they pitied me," he said. Until one professor pulled me aside and said, "Pity can't write like that." That's when it hit me. I was more than my story. I read that line 3 times. Then one more time out loud.
Just to let it land.
More than my story. I didn't sleep much that night. not because I was sad. Something inside me was shifting. I could feel it, like an old skin peeling away, layer by layer. For the first time, I let myself wonder what it might feel like to walk into a room and not apologize for being there. To believe I had a seat at the table, not because someone felt sorry for me, but because I earned it. Jude didn't know me. Not really. But he saw something in me. And more importantly, he didn't try to take it apart or explain it away. Maybe that's why it mattered. Sometimes, all it takes is one person who doesn't flinch when you speak. One person who reminds you you were never asking for too much. Just finally being seen. It was Saturday. The kind of muggy Asheville afternoon that made everything stick to your skin. Even the air. Mom had been preparing since morning. Tablecloth ironed, green bean casserole in the oven, extra folding chairs pulled from the garage. We were having company. Family. I already knew how the night would go before the doorbell even rang. Someone would bring wine that tasted cheap but came in a fancy bottle. Someone else would make a comment about how tall Troy was getting. The kids would sneak sodas and disappear into the den. And me? I'd be the background daughter. Quiet, helpful, forgettable. The dining room was loud with voices and clinking glasses. Laughter bounced off the walls, and plates passed hand to hand like clockwork. I sat wedged between Aunt Rochelle and a cousin I barely knew, carving polite smiles onto my face. And then it came. So, Mom said, lifting her wine glass with a smug little grin. Our girl here got a scholarship. Full ride. Reading Heights. Heads turned toward me. Someone actually clapped. But it didn't feel like celebration. It felt like display. Wow. Aunt Rochelle said, tilting her head. Is that the kind of scholarship they give when you're in one of those programs? You know, like for disadvantaged kids. There was a pause. I knew she didn't mean it to be cruel. But it landed just the same. Mom waved her hand like it was no big deal. Well, you know how those things work. They're always looking for diversity. And she's got that look, serious and a little lost. They eat that up. I stared at my plate. The roast chicken on my fork suddenly looked dry and strange, like something I didn't recognize. Troy snickered under his breath. Hey, at least it's not for sports. That would have been a real miracle. Everyone laughed. I didn't. What hit me hardest wasn't the words. It was the look Mom gave me afterward. That quiet, almost smug glance that said, See? Told you. You didn't get here because of talent. You got here because they needed a story. I felt my cheeks flush. My fingers twitched under the table, itching to grab something, anything, to steady myself. But instead, I just stood up. Excuse me, I said softly, pushing back my chair. I've got a headache. I think I'll lie down for a bit. Aunt Rochelle offered a half-sincere, Oh no, you okay, sweetheart? But nobody followed me upstairs. They were too busy refilling glasses and passing mashed potatoes. My room felt darker than usual. I turned off the lamp anyway. I pulled out my journal and sat on the floor, back against the bed, knees to my chest. My pen hovered for a second before moving. I always wanted to be the good daughter. I just didn't know it meant being small. I stared at the sentence for a long time. Read it out loud once, just to hear how it sounded in the room. It echoed back like truth. It wasn't just that they didn't believe in me. It was that they didn't want to. Because if I was right about myself, then maybe they were wrong about everything else. My phone buzzed. Jude. You okay? I hadn't told him about tonight. But I guess something about the way I went quiet earlier had said enough. Family dinner, I texted back. You ever feel like you're sitting in a room full of people who know you, but don't see you? He called instead of replying. I picked up on the second ring. I've been there, he said. His voice was low, steady, like a calm space I could step into. When I was 16, I wrote a poem that won this state contest. Dad found it by accident, read it, and said, You didn't write this. Must have copied it from somewhere. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. So I packed a bag, he continued, and I left for 2 weeks. Slept on my aunt's couch. First time I ever felt like my voice mattered. What happened when you came back? I asked. He never apologized. But I never wrote for his approval again. There was a beat of silence between us. A warm, weighted pause. Sometimes, he said, you don't need to fight. You just need to leave the room where no one hears you. I closed my eyes and let that settle. Because the truth was, I was tired. Tired of shrinking myself to fit into chairs that were never made for me. Tired of hoping they'd suddenly want more from me when they'd spent years teaching me not to. I didn't know exactly when or how, but I was starting to feel it. The urge to leave. Not just physically, but emotionally. Quietly, finally, and without apology. I told Mom I was leaving for school early. I said it casually, like it wasn't a big deal. Like I hadn't been rehearsing it in my head for days. They're offering an orientation program, I told her one evening as she wiped down the kitchen counter. It's for first-gen students. They help you get settled in, meet professors, find your way around campus. She barely glanced up. First-gen? I nodded. First in the family to go to college. She scrubbed harder, the cloth making tight little circles on the laminate. Is that something to advertise? I didn't respond. I packed in silence that weekend. Rolled my clothes neatly, tucked them into corners of the old navy suitcase we'd used for church retreats and summer trips to nowhere. I folded my towel, my hoodie, my one decent pair of shoes, and the cardigan I always reached for when I needed to feel like someone who had it together. Everything about the process felt sacred, final. Like I was putting distance between who I'd always been and who I might still get to be. The night before I was supposed to leave, I was in my room, zipping up the suitcase for the third time, when I heard her voice, sharp and too close. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her lips pressed thin. You're not going anywhere, she said, not before we talk to Pastor Grayson. People are asking why you're so eager to run. I turned toward her slowly. My fingers gripped the handle of the suitcase, like it might anchor me to the floor. Pastor Grayson? I asked. She nodded once. You need spiritual covering before stepping into a new season. That's what real families do. You don't just take off like some stranger. I didn't answer right away. My heartbeat felt loud in my chest, like it was trying to escape before the rest of me could. I'm not running, Mom, I said, voice even measured. I'm walking away from what you want me to be. Her face didn't change. Not right away. But something behind her eyes flickered. Not pain. Not confusion. It looked a lot like contempt. You think that's maturity, she said quietly. Abandoning the people who raised you, because some stranger said you were special? I'm not abandoning anyone, I replied. I'm choosing myself for once. We stared at each other for a long time. The air between us heavy with every word we'd never said, and all the ones we had, but never really meant. She turned and walked away without another word. I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed up rereading the letter from the scholarship committee, the one that said they saw promise in my voice. I wasn't sure if I believed them yet, but I believed in how writing it had made me feel. Like I mattered. Like I existed outside the roles I'd been shoved into. The house was still dark when I woke up the next morning. The sun hadn't risen yet, and the only light came from the tiny lamp on my nightstand. As I reached for my phone, I noticed something resting on my pillow. A plain white envelope. No name, no stamp. Just a single handwritten line across the front in my mother's careful, slanted script. Don't forget who raised you when you start pretending to be better. There wasn't even a love, Mom. Just that sentence, sharp enough to sting, short enough to carry 1,000 pounds. I stood there holding it for a moment. Then I sat down, opened my suitcase, and tucked it into the front pocket. But something about it didn't sit right. Like packing it meant agreeing with it. So I pulled it back out, smoothed the crease, then laid it on top of my nightstand like a piece of paper I'd already graded. Failed. It didn't belong with me anymore. By 6:30, I was wheeling my suitcase quietly down the front steps. No one was awake. No hugs, no goodbye breakfast, no "we're proud of you." Just the familiar creak of the porch boards beneath my shoes and the hush of a neighborhood that didn't know I was leaving for good. The air outside was cool, cooler than I expected. I paused at the edge of the driveway, taking one last look at the house. The shutters needed painting. The flower bed was empty, like always. It looked exactly the same as it always had. But I didn't. And I didn't look back. Not out of spite. Not even out of sadness. Just because I didn't need to anymore. I wasn't leaving with anyone's blessing. But I was leaving with my own. And somehow, that was enough. The first week at Reading Heights felt like stepping into someone else's life. Not bad, just disorienting. I had a single room on the 4th floor of Kavanaugh Hall, which smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and nervous energy. The window overlooked a small courtyard with benches that always seemed to catch the sun just right. Nobody from home called. Not once. I kept my phone on silent, checked it more than I should have. Part of me hoped for a message, even something passive-aggressive from Mom, just to prove I still existed to her. But there was nothing. And in that silence, I started to listen to myself. Every morning, I walked the same path from my dorm to the library, across the brick-lined quad, past the fountain that never worked right, under the archway carved with the school motto. I told myself to breathe it in, to remember that I belonged here. But it didn't come naturally. It was a kind of permission I had to keep giving myself. One afternoon, while reorganizing the bottom drawer of my desk, I found it, tucked between my orientation folder and a pair of socks I hadn't worn yet. My scholarship essay, printed on thick paper, the kind you buy when you think it'll make your words feel more permanent. I had planned to mail it to Mom after I got in. I even bought a card with a little lighthouse on it, thinking she'd like the image. But the envelope never got sealed. Never made it to the mailbox. I unfolded the pages, smoothed the corners, and sat on the edge of my bed. The first lines came back to me like a whisper from someone I used to be. I grew up learning that silence kept the peace. But silence also kept me small. I learned to disappear between dinner conversations and Sunday sermons, hoping if I was quiet enough, I could avoid becoming someone else's disappointment. I kept reading, my eyes moving faster as the paragraphs picked up weight. All those nights I wrote under my blanket with a flashlight, trying to describe what it felt like to matter so little you almost convinced yourself you liked it. It was all there. The last line hit harder than I remembered. Sometimes, the smallest voice is the one that survives the storm. I didn't cry because I was sad. I cried because something inside me felt seen. I had written that for the scholarship committee, yes, but also for the girl who had stayed quiet too long. The girl who was slowly learning she didn't have to anymore. Later that week, I stopped by the campus financial aid office to turn in a form they'd emailed about. I didn't expect anything else. Just signatures, a few initials. But the woman behind the desk, a kind-eyed woman in her 50s with silver-rimmed glasses, said, "Wait 1 second, Han. I think something came for you." She walked into the back room and returned with a small cream-colored envelope. My name was written on the front in dark blue ink. "There's no return address," she said, smiling. "But it came through internal mail. Must be from someone here." I thanked her, took the envelope, and sat outside on a bench to open it. Inside was a single sheet of letterhead paper. Reading Heights crest at the top, clean and simple. The handwriting was careful, but not stiff. Just enough curve to feel human. "Dear Lana, I wanted to reach out personally to let you know how deeply your essay moved our committee. We don't always get to tell students why they're chosen, and I think that's a disservice. You weren't chosen because you're poor. You were chosen because your words carried truth, and that is rare. Hold on to that voice. It's yours. Sincerely, Dean Samuel Calloway, Office of Academic Advancement." I didn't move for a long time. There was something about those words, your words carried truth, that filled the empty space my mother's voice used to take up. And the strangest part? I believed him. I really believed him. It felt like someone had walked into the room I'd been yelling into my whole life and finally said, "I hear you." No conditions. No lectures. Just acknowledgement. I folded the letter slowly, pressing the edges flat, and held it in my lap for a few minutes. Then I placed it inside the front pocket of my notebook, where I knew I'd see it every day. Someone had seen me not as a symbol, not as a pity case, but as a person with something real to say. And that was enough to steady me. It was one of those still, gray Tuesday mornings, the kind where even the birds sounded hesitant. My dorm was quiet, just the faint whirring of the fan in the hallway and someone's coffee maker sputtering a few doors down. I was halfway through reading a syllabus for my American Lit class when my phone buzzed. It was Jude. You might want to check the Gracewood Church Facebook group. I stared at the screen, confused at first. Jude wasn't someone who brought up Facebook casually. He barely used social media at all, said it made his anxiety spiral, and the noise got too loud. So when he mentioned something online, I knew it wasn't nothing. I opened the app with a kind of muscle memory. I hadn't checked the group in weeks, but I'd never left it either. Maybe some part of me wasn't ready to cut every string. Maybe I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, things might smooth over on their own. I scrolled past a few photos from last Sunday's service, a casserole recipe, and a prayer chain for someone's cousin in the hospital. Then I saw it. The post. It was from Mom. She didn't use my name. She never had to. It started with a Bible verse, Proverbs, I think. Something about humility and honor. Then came the tone I knew too well. Sweet on the surface, but barbed underneath. Some children forget their roots the moment they get a handout. We raised them in faith. We taught them humility. But pride comes easy when you believe you earned something all by yourself. I blinked. Read it again. Then again. The comments came fast. So disappointing. Kids today think they're too good for where they came from. She used to be such a sweet girl. Names I recognized. People who had sat in our living room, held my hand in prayer, brought us casseroles when Dad left. People who hugged me on Sundays, told me I was growing up so fast. And now they were tearing me down with the kind of confidence that comes from hearing only one side. What hit me hardest wasn't the judgment. It was how quickly they believed her version of the story. Not one of them asked why I left. Not one asked if it was true. They just nodded and agreed, because silence, I was learning, was a vacuum. And if I didn't fill it with truth, someone else would fill it with whatever served them best. I sat on my bed, still holding my phone, letting the weight of it settle. Like dust after something fragile breaks. I didn't cry. I didn't get angry, not right away. I just felt erased. Then Jude texted again. You can't stop them from talking, but you can make sure they're not the last ones to speak. I read it out loud, slowly. Let it hang in the room. My voice felt shaky but real. Like something I hadn't used fully in a long time. That evening, I opened my laptop. I didn't log into the church group. I didn't respond to her post. I didn't defend myself in the comments. I went somewhere else, somewhere that still belonged to me. My own page. I stared at the blinking cursor for a while. Then I took a breath and started typing. I've stayed quiet for a long time, mostly because I believed silence kept the peace. But now I see that silence also lets people tell your story without you. So let me tell you mine. I didn't leave home because I thought I was better. I left because I was tired of being reminded that I wasn't enough unless I stayed small. When I got my scholarship, I didn't expect applause. I just hoped for one moment, one genuine moment, where someone I loved would say, "I'm proud of you." Instead, I was laughed at, told I only got it because I was poor, told to be grateful for being chosen, not for what I had achieved. I didn't walk away out of pride. I walked away because I realized that staying meant disappearing, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of me but a version someone else had scripted. So no, this isn't about being better. This is about being allowed to breathe. I didn't add a quote or a Bible verse or some dramatic closing line. I didn't tag anyone. I just sat there, staring at that last sentence. Then I clicked post. The notifications started coming almost immediately. Not just from people back home, but from classmates, professors, a librarian from my old community college. A girl I hadn't spoken to since middle school messaged me. "Thank you. I didn't know how to say it before, but you just did." Some left comments. Some didn't say anything at all, just quiet hearts, quiet likes. But here's the thing. I didn't post it for them. I posted it for me. For the version of me who used to sit in the corner of the dinner table, folding her hands in her lap, praying someone would finally look up and ask what she was thinking. For the girl who was done waiting. And for the young woman who had finally found the courage to answer. The call came on a Sunday evening, just as the sky was beginning to turn a soft pink, and the shadows on the floor started to stretch longer than the furniture that cast them. My phone lit up on the desk beside me, vibrating against the wood with a quiet urgency.
Mom.
I didn't answer right away. I stared at the screen like it was a dare. A week had passed since I shared my post. The one that peeled back the truth I'd buried under years of politeness and obedience. I hadn't expected silence to last forever, but I guess a part of me, maybe the child part, still hoped it would. That I'd said enough for her to finally reflect instead of react. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Her voice came through immediately. No greeting. No hesitation. Just a blade, already sharpened. You made us look like villains. I blinked. Let the words hang. She always needed to speak first, always needed to control the opening line. Why would you do that to us? She continued, her voice rising just enough to sound controlled, but not calm. People are calling me. Calling the house. Asking questions at church. Do you have any idea what kind of mess you've made? I leaned back in my chair. Let the phone rest lightly against my cheek, my eyes on the slow-turning ceiling fan. I kept my tone even, almost bored. You did that, Mom. I just stopped pretending it didn't hurt. There was a pause. I could hear her breath catch, just a flicker, but it was there. She hadn't expected that. Especially not from me. Not from the daughter who always nodded, always folded, always backed down before the third sentence. We're family, she said next. Sharper now. Everything we did, every rule, every sacrifice, it was out of love. You don't get to twist that. That word. Love. I've heard people say it their whole lives, like it's enough to justify anything. Like if they tack on I love you, the hurt is somehow sanctified. It becomes ungrateful to question it. Unfair to name it. But I knew better now. I closed my eyes for a second, took a breath deep into my chest, and then said it, slow and steady. You don't get to call it love if it only works when I stay small. Silence. Full silence. I could picture her, standing in the kitchen, probably pacing, phone gripped tight like it might break if she let her fingers relax. Maybe her jaw was clenched the way it always was when someone pushed back. Maybe she thought I was going to take it all back next. But I didn't. And neither did she. No crying. No apology. No desperate plea for understanding. Just a clipped inhale, and then click. The tone of the call ending echoed louder than her entire speech. I didn't move. Not for a long while. I let the silence fill the room. But this time it didn't feel like a punishment. It didn't weigh on me. It didn't press into my lungs or curl around my throat. It just was. That was the difference. Before, silence meant exile. Rejection. A void I kept trying to patch with words, with patience, with hope. But now it felt like space. Like breath. Like finally having room to exist without apology. Later that night, I opened the drawer of my desk and pulled out the letter from Dean Calloway. The edges were soft now, creased from too many readings, from the nights I held it like proof I hadn't imagined everything. I pinned it to the corkboard above my desk, right next to my class schedule and the bus map to the grocery store. Not because it was pretty, not because I needed the reminder, but because I wanted to honor that moment when someone saw my voice for what it was and didn't ask me to shrink it. It wasn't a trophy. It was a promise to myself. The sun was almost gone now. The last of the light spilled across the floor, warm and gold, landing softly on the tops of my knees. I pulled my chair closer to the window and sat there, letting the quiet settle into the bones of the room. And I thought of her, the girl I used to be, the one who bit her tongue every time someone interrupted her, the one who rewrote every sentence in her head 10 times before saying it out loud, the one who sat in the corner of her own life and called it love. And for the first time, I didn't resent her. I felt sorry for her. Not because she was weak, but because no one ever told her she had a choice. Now I knew I did. I didn't need the last word. I didn't need to win the argument. I didn't even need closure. What I needed, what I had found, was the freedom to stop asking for permission to be whole. And as the light faded and the sky turned the color of ash, I whispered to no one in particular, almost like a prayer. I'm still here, and I don't need to disappear to be loved. Not anymore. 2 weeks passed. No calls. No texts. No vague church bulletin updates forwarded to my inbox. Nothing. The silence came not like thunder, but like fog, creeping in slowly, until one day I looked up and realized I hadn't heard her voice in 14 days. And somehow, it didn't split me in two. It didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It wasn't the kind of silence that screams or echoes or begs to be broken. It was the kind that settled in quietly, like dust in a room nobody visits anymore. A silence that wasn't angry or sad. Just finished. In that stillness, I started writing again. Not for school. Not for extra credit. Not even for Jude. I opened a blank document on my laptop one afternoon and sat cross-legged on my bed, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders and a chipped mug of cold tea next to me. There was no thesis, no plan, no draft number in the corner. Just a blinking cursor, and the feeling that something inside me finally had room to speak. I wrote, I used to think silence was love. I thought it meant respect, keeping the peace, not raising my voice, staying agreeable. I thought if I stayed small, stayed polite, stayed useful, I'd be safe. I'd be loved. I'd belong. But silence can also be a form of self-erasure. It took me 19 years to understand that love that only works when you disappear isn't love at all. I didn't cry as I typed those lines. Not like the night I wrote my scholarship essay, curled up in bed, deleting and retyping the same paragraph a dozen times. This felt different.
Clean. Steady.
Like rinsing out a wound that had already stopped bleeding. That weekend, Jude invited me to walk with him around the lake near the library. It was late afternoon. The kind of fall air that smelled like pine, mulch, and the promise of sweaters. We didn't say much at first. The gravel crunched beneath our feet, and a pair of ducks flapped lazily across the water. The world moved gently. When we reached the far side of the lake, we found an old bench with peeling green paint. The kind that creaked just enough to remind you it was still doing its job. Jude sat beside me, hands tucked into the sleeves of his hoodie. He looked out at the water for a while, then turned to me. I don't think healing is loud, he said. I glanced over. I think it's when you stop needing to explain why you left. I didn't respond right away, but something in me loosened. That invisible muscle that always clenched when someone brought up home, or family, or faith, it released. I hadn't forgiven Mom. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I didn't feel that urgency anymore, that need to be understood, to be redeemed in her eyes. I didn't need her to read my post or call me crying or show up with an apology baked into a casserole. I didn't need her recognition to feel real anymore. That was the change. A few days later, during a quick trip back to Asheville to see a friend, I ran into Mrs. Langley at the local grocery store. She spotted me in the produce aisle, squinting over a pile of bruised avocados. Lana Merritt, she said, smiling like she'd found a quarter on the ground. I almost didn't recognize you under that hoodie. We exchanged the usual pleasantries. Weather, college, how grown up I looked. Then her tone shifted just enough. You know, she said, leaning in a little, your mom has been quiet lately. Stopped going to church for a few Sundays now. People notice things. She wasn't trying to be cruel, just curious. Like someone poking at a bruise to see if it still hurt. I smiled politely and said, hope she's well, then steered my cart toward the checkout without adding anything else. Inside, I didn't feel guilt, or pride, or satisfaction. Just light. The kind of light that comes after a long, cloudy afternoon. Not blinding, not showy, just enough to remind you the sun is still there. That night, back in my dorm, I printed the essay I'd written the week before. Plain paper. No title. No flourishes. Just the truth. I pinned it to the corkboard above my desk with a single silver thumbtack. Not to show it off. Not to share it. Just to see it. To honor it. I read the last line aloud before turning off the lamp. I didn't lose a family. I found myself. And this time, I didn't need anyone to say it back to me. Because I believed it. Because I said it first. Sometimes, walking away isn't about anger or rebellion. It's about finally choosing to live in a space where your voice doesn't have to beg to be heard. Maybe you've been there too, caught between staying quiet to keep the peace and speaking up to keep yourself whole. If this story touched something in you, I hope you'll carry it gently, in your own time, in your own way. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories that speak to the quiet battles we rarely name, I'd be grateful to have you join me again.